The first time I met Myra Voss, she was arguing with a fence post. Not metaphorically. She had her hands on either side of a cedar post that had heaved up about 4 inches from a hard freeze the previous winter, and she was talking to it in the low, firm voice of someone who has made up their mind that the situation is going to resolve itself, and is simply communicating that resolution to the problem. I was riding along the South Ridge on my way to check the Alcott pasture for the landowner I worked for that season. A man named Colbert who owned more land than he could meaningfully use and less patience than he could afford. And I saw her there, and slowed my horse without really deciding to. She didn't look up. "It's coming out," she said, to the post, or maybe to herself. "Hard to tell." "Yes, ma'am," I said, because it seemed like the right response. She looked up then. She had a weathered face, not old, maybe 35, maybe 40, the kind of age that's hard to read on a woman who works outside, and dark eyes that took me in the way you take in a landscape when you're looking for water. Assessment, not judgment. "You work Colbert's east section," she said. "His South Ridge and the Alcott pasture, just checking fence today." "He fencing all the way to Sutter Creek now." "He is." She looked at the post, then at me, then at the post again. Expansive man. There was no particular heat in it. It was just an observation, delivered the way you'd note the weather. I wrote it down that evening. She says exactly what she means and not a syllable more. Reminds me of the way a good knife looks, no extra material anywhere. I learned her name from the Alcott boy later that afternoon. Mara Voss, widowed 3 years back. Her husband had worked a plot of farmland in the low valley between Sutter Creek and the dry wash, good land, people said, when the rains came correctly, which they hadn't done in going on 2 years. She'd kept the farm after he died. People had expected her to sell it. People had been wrong. The seeds came into the story about a week after that first meeting, which was also about a week after I started finding reasons to ride the South Ridge twice a day instead of once. I'll be plain about that. I'm not going to dress it up. I was interested in her the way a person gets interested when they encounter something that doesn't behave according to expectations. That is the honest version of it. Whether it was more than that at the time, I kept that question at the edge of my log entries, never quite writing it down directly, the way you keep a sore tooth at the edge of your tongue. The seeds arrived in a canvas bag on the seat of her wagon 3 days after she'd made a trading run to the post at Cimarron Crossing. She'd been gone 2 days, which was about a day longer than the trip should have taken. When she came back, Tommy Alcott, who was 14 and had agreed to watch her property in exchange for the use of her rain barrel, which was the only full barrel within a half-mile, told her that the Greer brothers had come by twice while she was gone. The Greer brothers were not men who made social calls. I heard about this from Tommy, who told things in the winding, doubling-back style of a person who wants to make sure you understand that they were not alarmed and had handled everything competently. What it amounted to was 2 men on horseback, the older one doing the talking, asking where the woman was and when she'd be back, and whether the place was being looked after. Tommy had said he didn't know anything about any of that, which was both untrue and exactly the right answer. When I rode past Mara's place the morning after she returned, I saw her at the edge of the low field, the one that had been fallow for 2 seasons, on her hands and knees with a stick, testing the soil. I pulled up and watched for a moment. She was pressing the stick in, pulling it out, pressing it in at a different angle. There was a systematic quality to it that I recognized as the opposite of hope. Hope is frantic. What she was doing was patient and precise, like reading a text you've read before, making sure you haven't missed anything. "What are you looking for?" I asked. "Water memory," she said. I didn't know what that was. I didn't ask. I wrote it down that night and thought about it for a long time. Water memory. The idea, I came to understand later, is that certain soils retain the pattern of where water has traveled through them, deep channels in the clay, microscopic paths, even when the surface shows nothing. If you know what you're looking for, you can find where water has been, and that tells you where it might be coaxed to go again. She'd learned that from someone. I didn't ask who, not yet, but I had suspicions even then. "You're going to plant this field," I said. "I'm going to try this field," she said, which was not the same thing. 3 days later, I came past at mid-morning and found her at the wagon, holding the canvas bag and looking into it with an expression I can only describe as measuring, like whatever was in the bag had made a claim about itself, and she was deciding whether to believe it. I got down from my horse, which I'd started doing without being invited, and she let me look into the bag without comment. The seeds were ugly. That is the only word for them. They were dark and wrinkled, and a few had a soft give to them that seeds should not have. They smelled faintly of earth and something else, something old, almost spiced. $15, she said. For all of that? For all of that? I kept my mouth closed about what I thought, which was that she had been cheated by someone skilled at it. I wrote down that evening, she paid $15 for what looks like the contents of a dry creek bed. I kept quiet. I've been wrong before. I try to remember that I've been wrong before. Then I added, because the log is supposed to be honest. I have not always been wrong before. Some of those seeds are dead. I would bet on it. She told me then a small piece of the story of how she'd gotten them. There had been an old man at Cimarron Crossing, Apache, she thought, though she said she wasn't certain and wouldn't say it, like she was sitting at the edge of the trading post with a canvas sack and a complete absence of any interest in selling anything. She'd been buying provisions and had seen him there, and something about the way he was sitting had caught her attention. Not the sack. The sitting, the quality of his stillness. She'd gone over, she'd asked what was in the sack. He'd shown her without speaking. I asked him what they were, she said. He said a word I didn't know. I said I didn't understand. He said, she paused, something crossing her face that I couldn't name, older than the creek. Then he looked at my hands. Your hands? He looked at my hands for a while, the calluses and things. Then he looked at my face. Then he said a price. $15. $15. And you paid it. I paid it. I wanted to ask why. I could see she was waiting for me to ask why. So I waited instead, because sometimes the reason comes faster when it isn't chased. She put her hand into the sack and held a few of the seeds in her palm. They looked like nothing in her hand. They looked like the kind of thing you find at the bottom of a pocket. Because of where he looked, she said finally. He looked at my hands first. Men who are trying to cheat you look at your money first, or they look at your face to see if you're easy. He looked at my hands. That's a farmer's look, or a person who's worked ground. He was looking to see if I could do what the seeds need. I wrote that down verbatim that night. It's still the truest thing in my log from that season. The next morning, she started planting. She planted in a pattern I didn't recognize, not the straight rows I'd grown up seeing on every farm I'd ever passed or worked. She planted in wide, loose spirals that moved outward from a central point, with irregular spacing that seemed random until you watched long enough to understand that she was responding to something in the soil that I couldn't read. She'd press the stick in, feel for something, move 6 inches left, press again. Her planting followed the water memory. Tommy Alcott came by at one point and watched for a while. Then he said, "That ain't how you plant." "It's how these get planted," she said, not unkindly. He watched a while longer. "Looks like chicken scratch from up on the ridge," he said. "Good," she said. I helped for a part of the afternoon, following her instructions, which were precise and delivered without any patience for cutting corners. Deeper there. The soil goes soft about 3 inches down. Find the soft part and put it in that layer. Don't pack it after. Leave it loose. I did what she said. My arms ached in unfamiliar ways by evening. When we were done for the day, she stood at the edge of the field and looked out at it. It looked like absolutely nothing. Disturbed ground, pale and cracked at the surface, darker where we'd worked. No visible evidence of anything planted, no green, no promise of any kind. "How long before we know?" I asked. "We'll know when we know," she said. That night I wrote, "She planted today. The field looks like a field that has given up. She does not look like a woman who has given up. I am not certain which one to believe." Then below that I wrote something I hadn't planned to write. The Greer brothers came past again today. Slowed at her fence line. Didn't stop. I stayed until dark. What I didn't write down, because some things you know but don't want to see in your own handwriting, was that the Greer brothers were in conversation with Colbert about purchasing that stretch of low valley land, and that the price Colbert was apparently willing to pay her for it depended heavily on whether she could prove the land was productive, or whether it stayed fallow for a 3rd season. A 3rd fallow season would give Colbert a legal argument about abandonment that the county would likely honor. She'd had 1 season to prove the field. She'd spent $15 on seeds that looked like they'd already given up. And the rains, which everyone in the valley checked the sky for every morning with the hopeful, defeated expression of people who have been disappointed too many times to stop hoping. were not coming. I know I should tell you that I trusted her, that I saw something in those seeds that told me it would all work out. That would be a cleaner story. But I'm telling you what my log says, and my log says, 3 weeks since planting, nothing. The soil is dry to 8 inches where I tested it today. The sky has not changed. I brought water from my barrel, a small amount, not enough, but something. She was not there when I came. I left the water and rode on before she returned. I didn't want her to see that I was starting to worry. The worry is important. Remember the worry. It's the thing that makes the rest of this true. I want you to picture something before we get into this. Picture a woman standing at the edge of a field that hasn't produced a single green shoot in 3 weeks. The dirt is pale and cracked like old pottery. The sky is the color of a dirty window. Every neighbor who passes on the road slows down just long enough to shake their head, maybe say something to whoever's riding beside them in the wagon, and then move on. Now picture that same woman reaching into a burlap sack and pulling out a handful of seeds that look, by every honest measure, like they should have been thrown into a fire. They're shriveled. Some are the color of old rust. A few are soft in the middle in a way that seeds are not supposed to be soft. She paid $15 for them. $15 she didn't have. Borrowed from a woman 2 creek crossings away who charged no interest but kept accounts in her head the way a bank keeps them in a ledger. Everybody on that road knew about those seeds. Everybody had an opinion. The seeds became a kind of shorthand in that valley for the specific kind of foolishness that visits a person when they've been alone too long and started making decisions without anyone sensible to check them. Heard she spent $15 on rot. Heard she's going to try the old ground. Heard nobody told her that ground's been dead since before her father came out here. Here is what nobody on that road was prepared for. The ground wasn't dead, it was waiting. And those seeds, those ugly, embarrassing, half-rotted seeds she'd bought from an old Apache man at a trading post who hadn't said more than 11 words to her, and hadn't needed to. Those seeds knew something about waiting that the rest of that valley had forgotten. I know this because I was there. I kept a log. I've kept a log since I was 19, when a trail boss I worked for told me a man who doesn't write down what he sees ends up arguing with himself about whether it happened. I wrote down almost every day of that season. Some of it's painful to read now. Some of it's the truest thing I've ever committed to paper. This is what I wrote. This is what I saw. Part 1, the ugly SEDS. The first time I met Myra Voss, she was arguing with a fence post. Not metaphorically. She had her hands on either side of a cedar post that had heaved 4 inches from a hard freeze the previous winter, and she was talking to it in the low, firm voice of someone who has made up their mind that the situation is going to resolve itself, and is simply communicating that resolution to the problem. I was riding along the South Ridge on my way to check the Alcott pasture for the landowner I worked for that season. A man named Colbert who owned more land than he could meaningfully use and less patience than he could afford. And I saw her there, and slowed my horse without really deciding to. She didn't look up. "It's coming out," she said, to the post, or possibly to herself. The distinction was unclear. "Yes, ma'am," I said, because it seemed like the only sensible response. She looked up then. She had a weathered face, not old, maybe 35, maybe 40, the kind of age that's hard to read on a woman who works outside, and dark eyes that took me in the way you take in a landscape when you're looking for water. Pure assessment. No judgment, just inventory. "You work Colbert's east section," she said. "His South Ridge and the Alcott pasture, just checking fence today. He fencing all the way to Sutter Creek now." "He is." She looked at the post, then at me, then at the post again. "Expansive man," she said. There was no heat in it, just a plain observation delivered the way you'd describe the weather. I wrote it down that evening in my log, the small notebook I carry in my coat pocket, which by that point in the season had developed a permanent curve from the shape of my chest. She says exactly what she means and not a syllable more. Reminds me of the way a good knife looks, no extra material anywhere. I learned her name from Tommy Alcott later that afternoon. Myra Voss, widowed 3 years prior. Her husband had worked a plot of farmland in the low valley between Sutter Creek and the dry wash, good land, people said, in a normal rain year which hadn't described any year in the last 2. She'd kept the farm after he died. People had expected her to sell it, move to town, find a boarding house and some kind of work that wouldn't kill her as fast. People had been wrong. The seeds came into the story about a week after that first meeting, which was also about a week after I had started finding reasons to ride the South Ridge twice a day instead of once. I'll be plain about that. I'm not going to dress it up. I was interested in her the way a person gets interested when they encounter something that doesn't behave according to expectation. That is the honest version. Whether it was something more than that, I kept that question at the edge of my log entries, never quite writing it down directly. The way you keep a sore tooth at the edge of your tongue. Present, but not yet committed to. The seeds arrived in a canvas bag on the seat of her wagon, 3 days after she'd made a trading run to the post at Cimarron Crossing. She'd been gone 2 days, which was about a day longer than the trip ordinarily took. When she came back, Tommy Alcott, who was 14 and had agreed to watch her property in exchange for the use of her rain barrel, which was the only full barrel within half a mile that season, told her that the Greer brothers had come by twice while she was gone. The Greer brothers were not men who made social calls. I heard about this from Tommy, who told things in the winding, doubling back style of a person who wants to make sure you understand that they had not been alarmed and had handled everything with complete competence. What it amounted to: 2 men on horseback, the older one doing the talking, asking where the woman was and when she'd be back, and whether the place was being looked after. Tommy had said he didn't know anything about any of that, which was both untrue and exactly the right answer for a 14-year-old boy standing alone in someone else's yard. When I rode past Mara's place the morning after she returned, I saw her at the edge of the low field, the one that had been fallow for 2 seasons, on her hands and knees with a stick, testing the soil. I pulled up and watched for a moment without speaking. She was pressing the stick in, pulling it out, pressing it in at a different angle, then moving 2 feet to the left and doing it again. There was a systematic quality to it that I recognized immediately as the opposite of hope. Hope is frantic, uneven. What she was doing was patient and precise, like reading a familiar text to make sure you haven't missed anything. "What are you looking for?" I asked eventually. "Water memory," she said. I didn't know what that meant. I didn't ask. I wrote it down that night and thought about it for a long time before sleep. Water memory. The idea I came to understand later, partly from watching her and partly from a conversation she had that I was near enough to overhear but hadn't been invited to, is that certain soils retain the pattern of where water has traveled through them. Deep channels in the clay substructure, microscopic paths worn by years of seepage. If you know what you're looking for, you can find where water has been, and that tells you where it can be coaxed to go again, given the right conditions and the right seed that expects to wait in dark ground for a long time before it sees anything worth pushing toward. She'd learned that from someone. I had suspicions even then about who. "You're going to plant this field," I said. "I'm going to try this field," she said, which was not the same thing, and she said it in a way that made clear she understood the difference. 3 days later, I came past at mid-morning and found her standing at the back of the wagon, holding the canvas bag open, and looking into it with an expression I can only describe as measuring. Like whatever was in the bag had made a claim about its own capabilities, and she was deciding how much of that claim to believe. I got down from my horse, which I'd started doing without being invited, and she let me look into the bag without comment. The seeds were ugly. There's no better word for it. They were dark and wrinkled, some the color of dried rust, some going soft in the middle in the way that seeds are not supposed to go soft. They smelled faintly of earth and something else, something old, almost like spice, but not quite, like a word in a language you've heard once and almost recognize. $15, she said. For all of that. For all of that. I kept my mouth closed about what I thought, which was that she had been cheated by someone skilled at cheating. I wrote down that evening, she paid $15 for what looks like a handful of dry creek bed. I kept quiet. I've been wrong before. I try to remember that I've been wrong before. Then I added, because the log is supposed to be honest above everything. I have not always been wrong before. Some of those seeds are dead. I would bet money on it. She told me then a small piece of the story of how she'd gotten them. There had been an old man at Cimarron Crossing, Apache, she believed, though she said she wasn't certain and wouldn't say it like she was certain, sitting at the edge of the trading post with a canvas sack and a complete absence of any interest in selling anything to anybody. She'd been inside buying provisions, flour, salt, lamp oil, and had seen him through the doorway, and something about the way he was sitting had caught her attention. Not the sack. The sitting. The quality of his stillness, which was specific and particular, not like a man resting, but like a man who had found the exact right place and was simply occupying it. She'd gone over, she'd asked what was in the sack. He'd held it open for her to look without speaking. I asked him what they were, she said. He said a word I didn't know. I said I didn't understand. He said, she paused. Something moved through her face that I couldn't quite name. He said, older than the creek. Then he looked at my hands. Your hands, I said. He looked at my hands for a long while. The calluses and the cracking around the knuckles and the dirt that doesn't fully wash out. Then he looked at my face. Then he said a price. $15. $15. And you paid it. I paid it. I wanted to ask why. I could see that she was waiting for me to ask, with the patient quality of a person who knows the question is coming and is ready for it. So I waited instead, because some explanations come faster when they're not chased. She put her hand into the sack and held a few of the seeds in her open palm, looking at them. They looked like nothing in her hand. They looked like the kind of thing you'd find at the bottom of an old coat pocket and throw away without thinking. Because of where he looked, she said finally. He looked at my hands first. Men who are trying to cheat you look at your money first, or they look at your face to see if you're easy. He looked at my hands. That's a farmer's look, or a person who knows what ground costs a person. He was looking to see if I could do what the seeds need done. I wrote that down verbatim that night. I still have it. It's still the truest single entry in the log from that entire season, and it's still the thing I think about first when I think about Mara Voss. The next morning, she started planting. She planted in a pattern I didn't recognize from any farm I'd ever worked on or passed through. Not the straight rows I'd grown up seeing on every field from the Missouri line to the New Mexico territory. She planted in wide, loose spirals that moved outward from a central point she'd marked with a stick driven into the ground, with irregular spacing that seemed random until you watched long enough and carefully enough to understand that she was responding to something in the soil that I couldn't see or read. She'd press her planting stick in, feel for something with her wrist, move 6 inches in a direction that wasn't quite any of the cardinal directions, press again. Her path followed the water memory she'd found in those 3 days of testing. Tommy Alcott came by in the late morning and watched from the fence for a while, the way boys that age watch things, with the posture of someone who hasn't decided yet whether to be interested or dismissive. That ain't how you plant, he said. It's how these get planted, she said, without looking up and without any particular edge in her voice. He watched for a while longer, shifting his weight. Looks like chicken scratch from up on the ridge, he said. Good, she said. He stayed another 20 minutes and then helped carry the seed bag when it got too heavy for her to set down and pick up each time she moved to a new section. He didn't say anything else about how it looked. I noticed that. I helped for a part of the afternoon, following her instructions, which were precise and utterly without patience for shortcuts or approximation. Deeper there. The soil goes soft about 3 inches down, find the soft layer and set it in there. Don't pack it after. Leave it loose so the first water can find it without fighting. I did what she said. I got it wrong twice, and she corrected me without making it feel like correction, just restated the instructions slightly differently until I understood it. My arms ached in unfamiliar ways by the time the light got long. When we were done for the day, she stood at the north edge of the field and looked out at what we'd done. It looked like absolutely nothing. Disturbed ground. Pale at the surface where the dry top layer had been moved, darker in the disturbed furrows. No visible evidence of anything planted, no green, no shape to it that suggested intention, no promise of any kind visible to any eye I could account for. How long before we know? I asked. We'll know when we know, she said. Not evasive, just honest about the limits of prediction. I rode home in the last of the evening light and wrote by lantern. She planted today. The field looks like a field that has given up on itself. She does not look like a woman who has given up on anything. I'm not certain which one to believe. Then below that, after I'd set the pen down and picked it back up, the Greer brothers came past again this afternoon. Slowed at her fence line on the south road. Didn't stop. Didn't say anything I could hear. Just slowed and looked at the field and moved on. I stayed until dark before I rode. What I didn't write down, because there are some things you know but don't want to see in your own handwriting, where they take on a permanent, committed quality, was that the Greer brothers were in active conversation with Colbert about purchasing that stretch of low valley land. The price Colbert was apparently willing to pay depended heavily on whether she could demonstrate productive use of the field. A third consecutive fallow season would support a legal argument about abandonment that the county recorder would likely honor without asking many questions. Colbert had a lawyer in town who was very good at asking no questions while pursuing outcomes. She had one season. She'd spent $15 on seeds that by appearance had already surrendered. And the rains, which every person in the valley checked the sky for each morning with the specific expression of someone who has been disappointed enough times that hope has curdled into something more like ritual, were not coming. The sky every morning was the same washed pale blue, dry as old paper, giving nothing. I know I should tell you that I trusted her completely, that I looked at those seeds and felt some instinct, some deep recognition that they would be everything she'd paid for. That would be a cleaner beginning. But I'm telling you what my log says, and my log says, 3 weeks since planting, nothing. The soil is dry to 8 inches where I checked it yesterday morning. I brought a small amount of water from my barrel, not enough, nothing like enough, but I couldn't not do something. She wasn't there when I came. I left it and rode out before she returned. I didn't want her to see that I was starting to worry. The worry is important. I need you to hold on to the worry. It's the thing that makes the rest of this true and not a fairy story. Because the next thing that happened wasn't a green shoot. The next thing that happened was that Colbert sent a man to her door with an offer. I was at the South Ridge fence the afternoon his man rode up to her property. A neat, dry-looking fellow in town clothes who worked in Colbert's lawyer's office and had the practiced smile of someone who delivers documents that benefit the sender. I was far enough away that I couldn't hear the words, but I could read the shape of the conversation from a distance. The man talking, Mara listening with her arms crossed and her weight slightly back, which is the posture of a person who has already made up their mind and is waiting for the other person to finish. Then the man handing over a folded paper. Then Mara taking it, glancing at it once, folding it again, and handing it back. The man looked at the returned paper like it had bitten him. He said something else. She said something that took 4 words, maybe 5. He put the paper in his coat pocket, nodded, turned, and rode back down the south road. She stood there watching him go until he rounded the bend and was out of sight. Then she went back to her planting stick and went to work on the last section of the field she hadn't gotten to yet. I wrote that down too. She handed the paper back. 4 words, maybe 5. I would give a month's wages to know what those 4 words were. I found out later from Tommy, who found out from his mother, who had heard from Clara Biggs, who lived close enough to the road to sometimes hear things carried on the wind, that what she'd said was, "Not yet. Come back." Not no, not never, not yet, come back. That distinction mattered more than I understood at the time. She'd left the door open, just barely, just wide enough for what came next to have a chance to matter. That night I sat with my log for a long time and didn't write anything. I just sat with it open to a blank page and thought about water memory and ugly seeds, and what a woman means when she says not yet to a man holding a paper that represents a way out of a situation that by every measure looks like it's going to end badly. I thought about the old man at Cimarron Crossing and where he'd looked first. He'd looked at her hands. I looked at my own hands for a while in the lantern light. Rope-burned palms, knuckles that had been split and healed wrong several times, dirt in the cracks the same as hers. The hands of a person who works ground, who tends things, who fixes what breaks and replaces what can't be fixed. Older than the creek, the old man had said. I didn't sleep much that night. In the morning, the sky was pale and dry and unchanged, and I rode the South Ridge before breakfast and looked out at her field, and it looked the same as it had looked every other morning, and I told myself that some things take the time they take, and that impatience is not a tool that works on soil. Then the first green appeared, not that morning, not even that week, but it appeared. And when it did, it appeared in a pattern, those soft, improbable spirals that looked, from the South Ridge on a morning when the light came in flat and long, like something that had been sleeping and had finally decided to wake up. I wrote 3 words in my log that morning. She was right. Then I went back and crossed out was and wrote is. Then I sat there in the saddle looking at those first small greens in the pale cracked field, and felt something I don't have a clean word for even now. Something between relief and awe and the particular specific shame of a person who has doubted something true. Tommy Alcott came up beside me on his old spotted mare and looked at the field for a long time without speaking. "Huh," he said. "Yeah," I said. We rode on. They thought she had wasted $15 on rotting seeds, until her field outlasted every farm around her. Part 2, the dry season teaches nothing new. The green came in wrong. That's what people said, and I understood why they said it, because it was true in the way that certain true things look like failures before they look like anything else. The shoots came up in those loose spirals, pale and thin at first, bunched in places and spread wide in others, with bare patches between that looked like mistakes. If you stood at the road and looked over her fence at the field in those first 2 weeks of growth, what you saw was a patchy, irregular mess that bore no resemblance to the clean, ordered rows of any farm that had ever produced anything worth talking about in this valley. Word got around fast. Word always got around fast in a place that small. I heard it from 3 different people in the span of a single afternoon ride. The seeds had done something, yes, but what they'd done wasn't right. Myra Voss's field had come up wrong. The old ground had tried and failed in a new way. The $15 was a story that would be told for years, just not the way she'd hoped, not as a triumph, but as a cautionary tale about the particular danger of listening to strangers at trading posts, instead of the people around you who had worked this specific soil and knew what it would and wouldn't do. Clara Biggs told my horse something to that effect while I was tying up at the post office, and she was loading flour into her wagon. She didn't speak directly to me. She spoke in the general direction of my horse, which is a thing some people do when they want to share an opinion without being held to it. "Heard that Voss field came up mixed," she said to the horse. "Heard it looks like a child drew it." "Good morning, Mrs. Biggs," I said. She loaded another sack. "Some seeds just don't take to ground that's been left alone too long. Nothing wrong with that. It's just nature," I said, which is the sound I make when I am maintaining my opinion without sharing it. What I knew, because I had ridden past the field that same morning and actually stopped and looked instead of glancing from the road and forming conclusions, was that the irregular spacing was not a failure. I'd gotten down from my horse and walked along the edge of the planted area, and I'd seen what the spacing was doing, or beginning to do. The clusters were positioned where the water memory ran densest, where the subsoil had the most moisture to offer, and the wider gaps were where the soil went dry too deep for the seeds to have found purchase. She hadn't planted wrong. She'd planted exactly where the ground could support growth and left alone the ground that couldn't, and the pattern of what was growing was a map of where the water lived underground. You had to know what you were looking at. Most people didn't stop to look. I walked back to my horse and stood there for a while with my hand on the saddle, not mounting up, just looking out at those spirals of pale green in the morning light. And I thought about how often the thing that looks like failure from a distance is something else entirely when you walk up to it. Then I mounted up and went to find Myra. She was at the edge of the field on the east side, crouched down, looking at a cluster of shoots so closely that her nose was nearly in the dirt. She had a small piece of broken pottery in her left hand, one of those flat terracotta shards that turn up in old ground everywhere out here, usually remnants of something people made and lost track of long before we arrived. And she was using the edge of it to very gently scrape the surface soil around the base of one shoot. I watched her do this for a minute without speaking. The care she was using was the kind of care that is almost painful to watch, the kind that makes the observer understand exactly how much is riding on the thing being cared for. "They're talking," I said. "I know," she said without looking up. "Clara Biggs thinks it came up wrong. Clara Biggs's field runs straight rows in soil that gets water from the creek channel," Myra said. "Her grandfather ran that channel. The water doesn't have to be asked, it's delivered." She moved the shard to the next chute and began again. "Mine has to find its own way." I crouched down beside her. The shoots up close were nothing special looking. Thin stems, pale green, small leaves that had the translucent quality of things not yet fully committed to their own existence. But they were upright, all of them, and the roots where she'd uncovered just enough of the base to check went down. "How far do they go?" I asked. "Deep," she said. "Deeper than they should at this stage. That's the variety. They root first and shoot later. Most seeds shoot first, get height, get light, then figure out the ground situation." She sat back on her heels. "These ones don't gamble on what's above." They secure what's below first. I thought about that for the rest of that day, on and off, in the way thoughts sit with you when they've attached themselves to something larger than the original subject. They secure what's below first. I wrote it in my log that evening with no commentary, just the words sitting there on the page by themselves, which is the way I record things when I don't yet know what to do with them. The rain still didn't come. The sky continued its pale, indifferent performance every morning, and the creek dropped another 2 inches by mid-month, and the Alcott family started hauling water from the far well 3 times a week, which was a significant undertaking, and told you something about how serious the dry had gotten. 3 families on the east end of the valley packed up and moved out, heading for somewhere with better prospects, and their empty houses sat at the road looking hollow and final. The Greer brothers bought one of those properties immediately, cash, quick, no discussion, which told you something about how long they'd been watching and waiting for the right conditions. Mara hauled water. Every other day she made the trip to the far well with her wagon and 2 barrels, and she portioned it out across the field with a discipline that was almost military. The same amount to each cluster, no section favored, nothing wasted on ground where she determined nothing was going to take. It took her the whole of the morning each watering day, and by the time she was done she moved like someone who was conserving energy for essential functions only, joints deliberate, jaw set, eyes checking the sky for clouds without any particular expression. I started helping with the water hauling. I told myself it was practical. I had access to Colbert's north tank, which was fuller than the far well and closer, and bringing some of that over a few times a week was no great hardship. That was the practical reason. The other reason, the one I wrote down and then half crossed out and then left in the log with a line through it that you can still read underneath. I can't watch from the ridge and do nothing. That has stopped being an option. We didn't talk much during the hauling. She wasn't a person who filled silence for the sake of filling it, and I'd learned quickly enough that the silences between us were not uncomfortable. They were working silences, occupied silences, the kind that exist between people who are both thinking about the same problem from different angles and don't need to narrate their process. What we talked about when we talked was the field, how it was progressing, what she expected next, whether the root depth she was seeing was unusual even for this variety. She had a name for them now, a name I couldn't pronounce correctly and eventually stopped trying to pronounce, settling for what she called them, which was the old ones, said with a very faint emphasis that felt like the word old was doing a lot of weight-bearing. "What does he call them?" I asked once. "The man at the crossing." She was quiet long enough that I thought she wasn't going to answer. We were pouring the second barrel, moving slowly along the east section together, her carrying the dipper and me carrying the bucket, both of us watching the ground drink. "He called them a name in his language," she said. "I asked him to say it again and he did. I asked him to say it a 3rd time and he looked at me and said in English, 'You have to earn the word for what they are.'" She poured another dip. "So I'm trying to earn it." I didn't ask what that meant. Some things you don't ask. You just keep moving and let the understanding come when it's ready. The first real test came in the 4th week. There was a wind. Not a storm, there was no rain in it, which by that point in the season felt like a personal insult from the sky, but a hard, sustained west wind that came up fast on a Tuesday afternoon and blew for 2 straight days. It took down a section of the Alcott fence. It stripped the young crop off the Harrison place completely, flattening weeks of work into a horizontal tangle that had to be written off. It tore the roof off old Jim Carver's equipment shed and sent the tin sheeting halfway across his pasture. I rode out the morning after the wind stopped and checked my stretch of Colbert's fence first, then rode to Mara's field. The straight-row crops in the valley were bent or laid over or, in the worst cases, gone. The Harrison field, which had been looking like one of the more promising plots in the valley before the wind, was a flat mat of damaged stalks that even an optimist would have called a loss. Mara's field was upright, not completely untouched. Some of the outermost shoots had bent at the tops, and there was a section on the northwest corner where the wind had come in hard off the dry wash and had pushed things over to maybe a 30-degree angle. But the spiraling clusters were standing. They weren't tall yet. None of them were, but what was above ground was standing, and when I dug up the base of one to check, carefully, putting it back after, the root system had gone down another full inch in the past 2 weeks. Deep and branching, holding the ground. Mara came out from the house when she heard my horse and stood at the field edge and looked at what was standing and what had bent and what had held. She stood there for a long time without saying anything, and I stood beside her and did the same, and the morning was very quiet after 2 days of wind, the kind of quiet that follows loud things and has a quality of held breath to it. "Northwest corner," I said. "I see it. Bent, not broken, could come back." "It will," she said, with the flat certainty of someone who is not guessing. I left her there and rode toward the Harrison place to see if I could lend a hand. William Harrison was standing in his field when I got there, alone, looking at the damage with the expression of a man who is holding himself very still because the alternative is not acceptable. He was a good farmer, careful, methodical, no worse than anyone else in the valley at making reasonable decisions. The wind hadn't cared. He saw me coming and nodded. I nodded back. "Bad," I said, because there wasn't a better word. "Yeah," he said. We stood there in his wrecked field, and he looked at the horizon the way men look at horizons when they're trying to find something on it that isn't there. Then he said, without any particular bitterness, which made it worse somehow, "Heard the Voss field came through." "It did." He was quiet. Then, that the field everyone said was planted wrong. "That's the one." He picked up a bent stalk and looked at it, then set it down carefully, like he hadn't decided yet what to do about it. "Funny," he said. He didn't sound like he thought it was funny. He sounded like a man filing information somewhere he'll need it later. I rode back to Mara's that evening before dark, not for any particular reason I'd have explained well, and found her sitting on the porch steps with a cup of something hot, looking out at the field in the last light. The field in that light had a quality I'd noticed before and not been able to account for, a stillness that was different from the stillness of ground that has nothing happening in it. The stillness of something gathered and purposeful. She didn't say anything when I rode up. I got down, tied my horse to the post, sat on the bottom step. She moved her cup to her other hand to make room. "Harrison lost most of his," I said. "I know, his wife came by this morning. People are going to look at your field differently now. People look at whatever produces and call it right," she said. "Same people will look at it differently again the first time something goes wrong." She was correct about that. I knew she was correct about that without any argument from me. "Do you care?" I asked. She thought about it honestly, which I appreciated. She didn't answer fast, the way people answer when they want to sound like someone who doesn't care what others think. "About their opinion," she said, "no. About what they conclude from the wrong reasons. Yes, because wrong conclusions lead people to wrong decisions, and sometimes those wrong decisions have consequences for me." She meant the Greer brothers. She meant Colbert. She meant the lawyer in town who asked no questions. "What are you going to do when Colbert's man comes back?" I asked. "What I told him last time," she said. "Not yet come back. He will come back, and he'll come back with a number that's lower." "I know. Myra." "I know," she said again, and the second time had a finality to it that meant she'd thought about this more than I had, and had reached a conclusion I wasn't quite seeing yet. "The field has to speak before I do. If I negotiate now, I negotiate with what might happen. I need to negotiate with what is happening. The old ones, securing what's below before reaching for what's above." I wrote that in the log that night, and below it, "She's doing the same thing the seeds are doing, rooting first. The harvest question comes later." Then I sat for a while and thought about a woman who'd paid $15 for seeds that looked like rot, and had gone home and thought about water memory, and had planted in spirals and hauled water every other day, and watched a wind take down the straight-row fields all around her while her stayed standing. And I thought about the old man at the trading post and where he'd looked first. And I thought he knew exactly what he was selling. He knew exactly who he was selling it to. The question I sat with that night, and which took me some time to work out an answer to, was whether she knew it too. By the look on her face when she'd handed back that paper, 4 words, maybe 5, not yet, "Come back," I thought she did. I thought she'd known it when she'd walked back to her wagon at Cimarron, crossing with a canvas bag of ugly seeds and 15 fewer dollars, and she'd made peace with the knowing before she'd even gotten home. The field was standing, the roots were down, the sky was still dry. "Come back," she'd said. And they would. That was the part that kept me up. There is a specific quality to the moment when a valley that has been dry for 2 years finally gets rain. It isn't relief, not immediately. The first response, and I've seen this in men and women and animals both, and I've felt it myself, is something closer to disbelief. a kind of physical argument with the evidence. You stand there in the first drops and your body keeps telling you it isn't real. It's a tease, it'll stop in a minute and the sky will go back to its pale indifference, and you'll feel worse for having let yourself feel the rain than if you just kept bracing. So the body refuses to celebrate at first. It waits. It's been burned too many times. The rain that came to that valley in the 8th week, after Mara planted her field, came in on a Thursday night, starting around midnight. I know the precise time because I was awake. And I was awake because I'd been sitting on my bunk in Colbert's hired hand quarters, staring at the ceiling with the particular restlessness of a man who has too many things he hasn't said, and has been running out of good reasons for not saying them. The sound of the first drops on the tin roof was a sound I felt before I heard it, like a vibration before a noise, and I lay there for about 30 seconds talking myself out of believing it, and then I sat up and listened, and the drops came faster, and I did something I haven't done since I was a boy. I laughed out loud, alone in a dark room, at a sound. Then I got up and got dressed and went outside. I rode to her field in the dark and the rain, which was not a rational decision, and I knew it was not a rational decision, and I went anyway. The rain came in hard by the time I got there, not a violent storm, but a true, steady, committed rain, the kind that means business, the kind that seeps rather than runs off. My horse was annoyed about the whole thing and expressed this through the quality of her walking, which became pointed and disapproving. Mara was already in the field. She was standing out in the middle of it in the rain without a hat, with her face turned slightly up in that way that isn't quite looking at the sky but is receiving it, and her arms were at her sides, and she was absolutely still. The rain was coming down around her, and the field was dark, and I couldn't see the plants in the night, but I could feel the smell of the soil changing. That specific smell that comes when dry ground gets water for the first time in a long while, a smell like something opening. I stopped my horse at the fence and watched her and said nothing. I don't know how long I was there, long enough. The rain kept coming. Eventually she turned and saw me, and we looked at each other across the fence and the field in the rain and dark and said nothing for a moment, and then she said, "You're going to drown out there." "You're already drenched," I pointed out. "This is different," she said. "I have something to be drenched for." I got down from my horse and tied her to the post and went through the gate and stood in the field in the rain. The ground under my boots had already begun to change. I could feel it through the soles, the slight give that comes when soil that's been bone dry starts to absorb. And the shoots, I could barely see them in the dark, but I crouched down and touched one, and it was upright, and the leaf surface was catching the rain and channeling it down the stem to the base, which was a thing I'd read about somewhere once and hadn't thought of since. "Will this be enough?" I asked. "This alone? No, but it doesn't need to be enough alone." She crouched down too, near another cluster. "It just needs to be the first." It was the first of 3 rains in the next 2 weeks, each one better than the last, each one pulling things out of the sky that the valley had been owed for a long time. The creek came up. The Alcott rain barrel overflowed for the first time in 2 seasons. The Harrison field, which had been written off, got enough water to salvage a partial planting, and William Harrison went about the business of salvaging it with the grim, grateful determination of a man who hasn't forgotten how to hope, but has learned to hope quietly. And Mara's field, those ugly, embarrassing $15 spirals, began to do something that the people driving past on the South Road found themselves slowing down to look at without quite deciding to. It grew. Not just grew. It grew in a way that had a quality to it that was hard to explain to anyone who hadn't watched it from the beginning. The old ones, she called them. And there was something in the growth that matched the name, something mature, something that had been waiting longer than this one dry season, something that seemed to understand exactly how much time it had and was not in any rush. The plants came up full and broad, the leaves a deep green that was darker than what the surrounding farms were producing, the stalks heavy in a way that said the roots were still doing their work below. Jed Greer came to the fence on a Tuesday morning. I saw him there when I came past on my regular South Ridge check, alone this time, which was unusual, because the Greer brothers operated as a unit the way fingers operate with a fist. He stood at the fence with his hat in his hands, which was also unusual, and looked out at the field for a long time. I slowed up. "Jed," I said. "Morning," he said. He kept looking at the field. He had the look of a man working through arithmetic that isn't coming out the way he expected. That's the $15 field, he said. It is. He was quiet for a while, his hat turned in his hands. Hector said it came up wrong, he said, Hector being his brother. I know what Hector said. Hector's wrong sometimes, Jed said in the mild tone of a man who has accepted a truth that cost him something to accept. He put his hat back on. Tell her he stopped, started again. Never mind, he rode off. I thought about that for a long time. What he'd been about to say. Whether it was something like tell her we're done pushing. Whether it was something else. I didn't tell Mara about it because I wasn't sure what to tell her, and because some things need to stay unspoken until the person who needs to say them says them directly. I wrote it in the log and left it there. Colbert's man came back on a Thursday, as she'd predicted. Same dry-looking fellow from the lawyer's office, same practiced demeanor, but the practiced demeanor had a different quality this time. It was working harder than before, which is what practiced demeanors do when they've encountered a development they weren't prepared for. He came up the road past the field, and he'd have had to be blind not to see it, and he was not blind. She met him at the gate. I was on the ridge, close enough to see but too far to hear, and I watched the exchange with the full attention of a person who has been invested in the outcome for long enough that the moment of it arriving feels almost physical. The man talked. Myra listened with her arms crossed and her weight back. He produced a paper. She looked at it longer this time than she had the first time. She said something, he said something, she said something else. Then she handed the paper back. Same as before. The man looked at the returned paper and then at her and then at the field which was behind her and which was impossible to look past. He said something else, final sounding. She said something. He put the paper away and rode off. I was at her gate in under 10 minutes. Same offer, I asked. Lower offer, she said. He said the irregularity of the planting pattern could be interpreted as careless management by a county assessor. They really are going to pursue the legal angle. They're going to try, she said, but the assessor would have to come out and look at the field. And the field is producing yield that any assessor would have to document, she said. You can't argue abandonment of productive farmland. That's the law. And this, she turned and looked at the field with an expression I can only describe as the expression of someone looking at something they've earned. This is very clearly productive farmland. She was right. By any objective measure, the field was producing. The yield per planted area was going to come out better than the valley average. Better, I found out later, than anything grown in that specific section of Low Valley since the ground was first broken, which people attributed to various things. The rain timing, the soil having rested, the unusual spacing that allowed each plant access to what it needed. People attributed it to everything except the seeds, mostly. Because the seeds had been the punchline of a joke for long enough that revising the punchline required more adjustment than most people wanted to make. Mara let them attribute it however they needed to. She didn't correct anyone. She didn't claim anything beyond what she'd done, which was to plant in a way she'd learned from someone who'd looked at her hands first and seen that she could be trusted with something worth trusting. Clara Biggs came by one afternoon in the harvest season, which was early October by then, and stood at the fence for a while, and then came through the gate, which she hadn't done before, and walked along the edge of the planted area looking at the plants with the expression of someone who is revising a conclusion. Mara walked alongside her without saying anything. Finally Clara said, I heard you bought the seeds from an old Indian at the crossing. An old Apache man, Mara said, at Cimarron Crossing. And they were expensive. They were worth the price. Clara was quiet for another bit of walking. My grandmother's people had crops like this, she said, and then stopped herself, as if the sentence had arrived before she'd decided whether to say it. She looked at Mara. Before the rows, she said, before all the straight lines. Mara didn't respond immediately. She let that sit where it had landed. He didn't teach me anything, she said finally. He sold me something, I had to figure out the rest. How'd you know how to figure out the rest? I didn't, Myra said. I had to find where the water had been and work backward from there. Clara looked at the field for another long moment. Then she nodded, once, the way people nod when they've received information that they're going to need time to process properly, and went back through the gate and got on her wagon and drove away. I was at the fence during that conversation, doing something unnecessary with a fence board that didn't need adjustment, and I heard every word of it. I wrote it all down that evening. Then I wrote something else, something I'd been building toward for the length of that whole log. I think what she's been doing is not about the seeds at all. The seeds are the excuse, or maybe the invitation, the thing that let her try the field at the right angle. What she's actually been doing is the same thing she watched the ground do for 3 fallow seasons. Waiting, storing, running deep before running visible. The harvest came in on time. Better than on time. She filled her storage without asking anyone for help, which was a matter of principle for her and also a matter of stubborn pride that she wore without apology. Tommy Alcott helped without being asked, showing up 2 mornings in a row with his spotted mare and no explanation, working until the work was done. And when she tried to give him something for it, he waved her off in the way of a person who has decided this is a debt they're paying for reasons that aren't about her. Colbert's lawyer sent a letter in November that was notably different in tone from the previous communications, formal, precise, and notable primarily for what it didn't say. It didn't mention abandonment. It didn't mention assessment. It mentioned an interest in discussing future land use arrangements, which was the legal way of saying, the previous strategy has been retired and we are prepared to be reasonable if you are. She wrote back a letter I didn't read. She wrote it at the table one evening while I sat on the porch because she'd asked me to stay for supper, and I'd stayed past supper into the part of the evening that has a different quality from supper. When she finished, she folded it and sealed it without reading it back to herself, which is what you do when you know exactly what you've said. Good, I asked when she came out. Clear, she said. I didn't ask what it said. I knew I'd find out eventually, or I wouldn't, and either way the letter was hers and the outcome was hers, and I'd spent enough of the season being careful not to take from her the satisfaction of her own results. What I will tell you is what I wrote in the last entry in my log from that season, which I wrote the evening of the first real frost, sitting on the porch steps with a lantern because I didn't want to go inside yet, and the cold was the interesting kind of cold, clean and specific. The field is in. Every other farm in the valley that had trouble this year had some of the same trouble she had, and some of it worse, and some of them got through and some of them didn't. The Greer brothers are still here. Colbert is still buying land when he can. The creek is back up. Clara Biggs is talking about trying something different on her south-facing slope next spring, and has been over twice to ask Mara questions that she frames as comments. Tommy Alcott has started keeping a log, which I take some credit for, though I suspect he'd dispute that attribution. Mara got a letter back from someone at the crossing. I didn't see it. I only know it arrived and that she read it standing at the mailbox, and then folded it carefully and put it in her coat pocket and went back to work without saying anything. I don't know what it said. I don't know if the old man reads correspondence or if someone read it to him or if he sent the letter himself or had it sent. I know that she smiled at something in it, standing there in the cold at the mailbox, and that the smile was private and satisfied and had the quality of a completed sentence. The field outlasted everything around it this season. By the measures that matter, it was the best producing plot in the low valley. People have their explanations. Most of the explanations don't include the seeds. Most don't include the man who looked at her hands before he set a price. I keep thinking about what she said. He wasn't teaching, he was selling. She had to figure out the rest herself. But the thing about that is, and this is where I've gotten to after a whole season of thinking about it, the selling was the teaching. He sold her something that required her to learn what she didn't know in order to use it. That's a different kind of gift than instruction. That's a gift that trusts the receiver. I don't know if I'll stay on through next season. I'm not sure I have a reason to leave. Those 2 things have been sitting in me at the same time for a while now, and I've gotten comfortable letting them sit.